It started as an ordinary camping trip. I was excited to get away from the noise of the city and spend a weekend in the woods. I had my tent, sleeping bag, flashlight, everything I needed. There was no phone signal, but that was the whole point. Disconnect for a bit, roast marshmallows, and enjoy the quiet. I picked a remote spot deep in the forest, far from any other campsites. The trees were thick, their branches clawing at the sky, and the ground was covered with a blanket of dry leaves. It was peaceful, in a way that made me feel small, but not in a bad way. Just quiet. Too quiet. As the sun dipped behind the hills, I lit my campfire and sat down, staring into the flames as they danced and crackled. Night fell fast. The forest was ink black, and the only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves and distant hoots of owls. It was calming at first, until it wasn't. The firewood snapped, and suddenly I became aware of how alone I was. No roads nearby, no houses, just me and the trees. And then I heard it, a snap of a branch. I froze, straining my ears, but the sound didn't come again. Probably a raccoon, I told myself, or a deer. I went back to my fire, tried to relax, but my mind kept drifting to the darkness just beyond the firelight. Something about the trees felt off, like they were watching. I tried to shake off the thought, but it clung to me like the chill in the night air. And then I heard it again. This time it was closer. A crunch of leaves, like something or someone was walking. I turned, aiming my flashlight toward the sound, but I saw nothing, just trees and more trees. I listened carefully, but the footsteps had stopped. A sense of unease crept into me. I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe it was a fox or some small animal scurrying around. I took a deep breath, but as I exhaled, I swear I heard something. Breathing, I jerked my head to the side. My flashlight beam swept across the woods, catching only glimpses of tree trunks. For a moment, I thought I saw something. A shape, just on the edge of the light. Something too tall to be an animal. Something still. I stood up, my heart pounding. "Hello?" I called, trying to sound brave. My voice felt swallowed by the forest. No response. I sat back down, forcing myself to believe I was just tired, my imagination running wild. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching, waiting. It was past midnight when I finally crawled into my tent, zipping the flap shut. The fire outside had dimmed, and the woods had fallen into a thick, suffocating silence. I lay there, wide awake, listening. I told myself everything was fine. Over and over again, it was just the woods. Then, from the other side of the tent, I heard it, a whisper. "Come outside." I stopped breathing. The voice was low, rasping, barely a whisper, and yet somehow it was clear, too clear, too clear. It came again. "Come outside. Come see us." Us? My skin crawled. Every part of me screamed not to move, not to make a sound. But the zipper on the tent, my tent, started moving. Slowly, steadily. I clutched my flashlight, gripping it so tightly my knuckles went white. The zipper stopped halfway, and for a moment everything was still, silent, and then I saw it. A shadow at the entrance of my tent, crouching. It was human-shaped, but wrong. Its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. I scrambled back, kicking my sleeping bag away as the thing slowly peeking inside the tent. Its face, if you could call it that, was pale, with hollow eyes that seemed to absorb the light. And that smile. God, the smile stretched too wide across its face like someone had torn its mouth open. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. Then, in a voice that was both familiar and strange, it whispered again, "Don't look at the trees." And just like that, it vanished, gone as if it had never been there. I bolted out of the tent, flashlight shaking in my hand. The fire was out, the woods darker than ever. I scanned the area frantically, trying to catch a glimpse of the thing. But there was nothing, just the trees. Standing tall and silent, I wanted to run, I wanted to scream, but something kept me rooted to the spot, an overwhelming sense that I wasn't supposed to leave, as if the woods were waiting for me to make the wrong move. Then I saw them, figures standing just beyond the edge of my camp. At first, I thought they were trees, their outlines blending into the darkness, but then they moved, slowly, jerking like puppets with tangled strings. They swayed, shifting from side to side, their heads tilting in unison, and every single one of them had the same smile. "Don't look at the trees," they whispered again, voices overlapping like a nightmare choir. I couldn't move. I knew if I ran, they'd follow. If I stayed, they'd close in. My pulse roared in my ears, and all I could think was, why did I come here? Then, without thinking, I turned off my flashlight. Plunged into darkness, the woods around me came alive with sound. Rustling leaves, soft footsteps, low whispers circling me. I shut my eyes tight and clamped my hands over my ears, but the voices were inside my head now. Don't look at the trees. Don't look at the trees. Over and over. The words twisted in my mind like vines, choking me. I don't remember how long I sat there, paralyzed by fear. Minutes? Hours? When I finally opened my eyes, the sun was rising, casting weak light over the forest. The figures were gone. My tent was still standing. Everything looked normal, like nothing had ever happened. But I knew better. The woods had let me go, but only for now. I packed my things in a frenzy, not caring about the mess I left behind. As I hurried down the trail, I glanced back just once. And that's when I saw it. A figure standing among the trees, watching me. Its smile stretched wide. And then, as I blinked, it melted into the forest, vanishing without a sound. Even now, back in the safety of my apartment, I can still hear the whisper in the back of my mind, soft as the rustle of leaves. Don't look at the trees. Story the end.
Story number 2.
There's something about camping in the woods that I've always loved. The crackling of the fire, the scent of pine, the stars blanketing the sky. But now, as I sit by this flickering fire, alone, I can't shake the feeling that something is watching me. And it all started last night. I had set up camp in a spot I found deep in the forest, a few hours' hike from the nearest road. I wanted isolation, peace, an escape from the world. The woods were supposed to be my sanctuary, but something was off. Last night, after setting up my tent and eating dinner, I decided to take a short walk to stretch my legs. It was already dark, the kind of darkness where your flashlight barely cuts through the shadows. As I walked, I noticed how unnervingly quiet it was. No owls hooting, no rustling leaves, just silence, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I didn't think much of it at first, just chalked it up to being deep in the woods. But then I heard it, a faint whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind. But no, this whisper was different, low and chilling, like someone standing inches behind me. I whipped around, my heart racing, but no one was there. The whisper stopped. I figured it was my imagination playing tricks on me, and hurried back to camp. That night, sleep was impossible. I kept waking up, sure I heard footsteps circling my tent. Whenever I peeked out, nothing, just darkness and the sound of my own heavy breathing. I told myself it was probably an animal, but deep down I knew something wasn't right. Today, things got worse. I spent the day fishing by a nearby stream. I thought the daylight would make me feel better, but there was this constant feeling of being watched. The shadows between the trees seemed to stretch out toward me, creeping closer every time I looked away. But every time I turned my head, nothing. No movement, no sound. Still, that sensation of eyes on me never left. By the time I got back to camp, the sun was setting. I hurried to build a fire, desperate for the light. But the shadows around my campsite seemed alive, like they were waiting for darkness to fully descend. That's when I saw it. Across from the fire, just at the edge of the light, a figure stood between the trees. At first, I thought it was a person, maybe a lost hiker. I called out, "Hey, do you need help?" No answer. The figure didn't move, didn't even flinch. It just stood there, staring. The longer I looked, the more I realized something was wrong. The figure was tall, unnaturally tall, its limbs long and thin. Its face, I don't know if it even had one. There was something shadowy, featureless, where a face should have been. I felt a chill race down my spine. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Suddenly, the figure moved. It stepped back, disappearing into the darkness of the trees. My heart pounded in my chest, and I scrambled for my flashlight. I shined it into the woods, but there was nothing. No trace of anyone. Just the crackling of the fire behind me and the overwhelming silence. I sat back down, trying to calm my racing heart. Maybe it was a trick of the light, I told myself. Maybe I was just tired, letting my imagination get the best of me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. As the fire burned low, I kept glancing toward the trees, half expecting the figure to return. And then I heard it again, the whisper. This time it was louder, clearer. It was coming from the trees where the figure had disappeared. It wasn't the wind, it was a voice. My heart raced as I strained to make out what it was saying, but the words were impossible to understand, like a distant echo. Then, without warning, the fire died. 1 second it was blazing, and the next it was out, like someone had snuffed it out with a single breath. I was plunged into darkness. I grabbed my flashlight, frantically clicking it on, but the beam barely seemed to cut through the night. And then, just at the edge of the light, I saw them. Multiple figures, standing in the shadows, just watching. There were 5, maybe 6 of them, all tall, all the same faceless shadows. The whispers grew louder, surrounding me, coming from all directions. My heart pounded in my chest, and I did the only thing I could think of. I ran. I bolted through the woods, the flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. The whispers followed me, growing louder, closer. I didn't dare look back. I could hear the rustling of leaves behind me, footsteps that weren't mine. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't stop. Eventually, I reached a clearing. The whispers stopped. The woods were silent again, but I could still feel them, just beyond the tree line, watching, waiting. I don't know what those things are, but I'm not staying to find out. I've packed up my gear and I'm heading back to the road, back to civilization. Whatever is out there in the woods, it doesn't want me here. It wants me gone. Or worse, it wants me to stay. But I'm not sticking around to figure out what that means. If you're watching this, if you ever go camping, be careful where you set up camp. Sometimes the woods aren't as empty as they seem, and if you hear whispers at night, don't look, don't listen, just run. Story the end.
Story number 15.
It started as a simple camping trip, a weekend getaway from the city, away from the noise, just me and my best friend, Alex. The forest was dense, and we hiked deep, far away from any signs of other people. Exactly what we wanted, total seclusion. We set up camp in a small clearing near a stream. The trees were towering overhead, their branches forming a thick canopy that barely let any sunlight through. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. But that first day went off without a hitch, pitching the tent, gathering firewood, cooking dinner by the fire. It wasn't until nightfall that things began to unravel. It started with a sound, a faint rustling just outside our camp. At first, I brushed it off as an animal, probably a deer or some other nocturnal creature, but then it got closer. The sound wasn't random or scattered like an animal foraging. No, it was slow, deliberate, like footsteps circling the campsite. "Did you hear that?" I asked, glancing at Alex across the fire. "Yeah," he said, his eyes darting to the dark edges of the clearing. "Probably nothing. Let's not freak ourselves out." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, just beyond the glow of the fire. I kept my flashlight close, my ears straining for any other sounds. We stayed up longer than planned, both too uneasy to sleep. But eventually, exhaustion won out. Sometime after midnight, I woke up suddenly. It was dead silent. No crickets, no wind, nothing. My eyes adjusted to the darkness, and that's when I saw it. Just outside the tent, a shadow, tall and unnaturally still. It wasn't moving, but I could sense it was looking at me, even though I couldn't see a face or any distinct features. I froze, barely breathing, trying to figure out if I was dreaming. But the sound of my heart pounding in my chest was too real. I nudged Alex, whispering his name, but he was out cold, snoring softly. I didn't dare make a sound. For what felt like hours, I watched that shadow just stand there, unmoving, almost blending into the darkness. My mind raced, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a tree, a trick of the light, something my tired brain was conjuring up. But no, deep down, I knew it wasn't. It was something else. Eventually, I drifted back into an uneasy sleep, but when I woke up in the morning, the shadow was gone. I told Alex about it, but he laughed it off, calling me paranoid. I wanted to believe him, to convince myself it had all been a bad dream, but the unease never left me. We spent the next day exploring the woods, trying to shake off the weirdness of the night before. But the feeling of being watched persisted, like unseen eyes were following us through the trees. Every time I turned around, there was nothing, just the same endless forest. By the time we got back to camp, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the clearing. That's when we noticed it, the pile of stones. It was small, just a few rocks stacked neatly on top of each other, but it hadn't been there before. "What the hell?" Alex muttered, crouching down to inspect it. "You think someone's messing with us?" I didn't answer. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it. The stones were placed deliberately, like some kind of marker or warning. But we hadn't seen anyone, not the whole time we'd been out here. "We should leave," I said quietly, my stomach twisting with dread. "Relax. It's probably just a hiker passing through," Alex said, but even he didn't sound convinced. Night fell quickly, and with it, the oppressive silence returned. We sat by the fire, but the usual comfort it brought was gone. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, waiting for the darkness to fully take over. Around midnight, the footsteps started again. This time there was no mistaking it. Slow, heavy, deliberate. They circled the camp, just out of sight, always staying in the shadows. Alex stood up, his flashlight sweeping through the trees. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice steady but tense. No answer. The footsteps stopped, and for a second I thought it was over. But then, from behind us, a low whisper. It wasn't in English or any language I recognized. It was soft, almost like a chant, growing louder and more insistent. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the sound. My heart nearly stopped. There, at the edge of the clearing, was the figure. The same shadow I had seen the night before, but this time it was closer. Much closer. It was tall, taller than any person should be, with elongated limbs and no discernible face. Just a dark, shifting void where features should be. The chanting grew louder, almost deafening, though the figure itself never moved. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Alex by the arm. We bolted into the woods, our flashlights bouncing wildly in the darkness. The chanting followed us, growing louder, closer, like it was coming from inside our own heads. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel it chasing us, hear the heavy, unnatural footsteps behind us. Branches whipped at my face, roots threatened to trip me, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. We ran until we burst out of the trees and onto the trail leading back to the road. Only then did the chanting stop. We didn't speak the entire way back to the car. The silence was heavy, suffocating, but I could tell Alex was as shaken as I was. When we finally made it back to the car and sped away, I glanced into the rearview mirror. Just for a second I thought I saw it, standing at the edge of the trees, watching us leave. I haven't been camping since, and I don't think I ever will again.
Story number 4.
It was supposed to be a peaceful solo trip, just me, the forest, and the stars. I'd done some camping before, but this was my first time going so deep into the woods alone. I needed the space, the quiet. No cell service, no emails, no distractions, just the crackle of the fire and the endless black sky. The first night was perfect. I set up my tent beside a small clearing, cooked some canned soup over the fire, and listened to the distant sounds of wildlife. Everything felt right, simple and serene. The second night, that's when it started. It began just after sunset. I'd crawled into my tent, zipped up, and was trying to get comfortable in my sleeping bag when I heard footsteps outside. At first, I thought it might be an animal, but the steps were too heavy, crunching leaves in deliberate patterns. Someone was walking out there. I sat up, my heart racing, and grabbed my flashlight. The footsteps stopped the moment I unzipped the tent. I shined the light through the trees, but I saw nothing, just the flickering shadows cast by the dying fire. "Hello," I called. No response. Just the whisper of the wind in the branches. I convinced myself it had to be my imagination or maybe a deer passing through. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I threw some more wood onto the fire and forced myself to lie back down. I eventually drifted off. That was the first mistake. I woke up in the middle of the night to the click of the zipper on my tent. Someone or something was unzipping it, slowly and deliberately. I froze, every muscle in my body locking up. I reached for my flashlight, but my hand fumbled in the dark. The zipper stopped halfway. I lay there, staring at the opening, waiting for something to crawl in. The flap shifted slightly, like it had been nudged from the outside. "Who's there?" I whispered. My throat was dry, the words sticking like glue. Nothing, just the flap of fabric swaying slightly in the breeze. I didn't dare move for what felt like an eternity. Eventually, I grabbed the flashlight and aimed it at the entrance. Nothing was there, just the quiet, empty forest. I forced a laugh, probably the wind. That's all it was. Yeah, the wind. I zipped the tent back up and tried to fall asleep again, telling myself that everything was fine, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The next morning, I found something strange outside my tent. A single footprint, right in front of the flap. It wasn't mine. It was too large, and the tread looked wrong. Almost like a boot, but with some kind of jagged pattern. I stared at it for a long time, trying to convince myself it wasn't what it seemed. Maybe it had been there when I set up camp and I just hadn't noticed, right? I packed my gear a little faster that morning, planning to hike out early. Something about the woods felt different now, like the trees had closed in around me overnight. The air felt thicker, and the quiet wasn't peaceful anymore. It was heavy. As I walked, I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling like I was being followed. I told myself I was being paranoid. There was no one out here. There couldn't be. Then I found something else. Half a mile down the trail, sitting neatly in the middle of the path. A leather boot. Old, cracked, and covered in dirt. It was the exact same size as the footprint outside my tent. My stomach dropped. I didn't touch it. Just stood there, heart pounding in my chest, every instinct screaming at me to turn around and run. But I didn't. I don't know why, but I kept walking, Faster now. That's when I saw him. A man standing between the trees up ahead. At least I think it was a man. His clothes were ragged, his skin pale as paper. He was standing perfectly still, half hidden behind a tree trunk, his eyes fixed on me. I stopped in my tracks, my mouth dry. "Hey!" I called, but he didn't respond. He just stared. I felt a cold chill creep down my spine. Something about him wasn't right. His posture was off, his limbs too long and awkward, like he didn't quite know how to stand like a person. I took a step back, and he mirrored me, stepping forward, his body jerking unnaturally. I couldn't see his face clearly through the shadows, but I saw enough. He was smiling. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was stretched too wide, like his face wasn't made for it. That's when I noticed the boot. He was only wearing one. The other boot, the one I'd found on the trail, was his. I didn't wait to find out more. I turned and ran, heart pounding in my chest, legs burning as I sprinted down the path. Branches slapped my face, roots tripped me up, but I didn't stop. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps quick and erratic, crashing through the underbrush. I ran faster, lungs screaming for air, the forest blurring around me. I glanced back only once, and I wished I hadn't. He was closer now, impossibly close. His smile had grown even wider, his eyes wild and empty. And he wasn't running. He was floating, his feet barely brushing the ground, his arms hanging limp at his sides. I ran harder than I've ever run in my life. The trail was a nightmare, twisting and endless, but somehow I made it back to camp. I grabbed my things, didn't even bother packing properly, and took off again, heading for the car. I didn't stop until I was back at the parking lot, slamming the door of my car shut behind me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the keys into the ignition. As I peeled out of the lot, I glanced back at the trailhead one last time, and there he was, standing at the edge of the woods, smiling that horrible, too-wide smile. He raised a hand slowly, as if to wave goodbye. I floored the gas and didn't look back again. I haven't been camping since, and I never will. Story the end.